don't know Cohere for AI, we're a non-profit research lab that supports fundamental research on machine learning through open science. We're part of the language model company Cohere. And through all our work, we engage in a range of conversations about the technical governance of AI and AI technologies, and we encounter a vast array of insightful perspectives along the way. So this series is our effort to bring those conversations to a broader audience, and in each session, we bring together experts from industry, academia, civil society, or government to explore different topics from the world of responsible AI development, governance, and policy. And the goal isn't to present a particular set position or rehash old ground, but to instead pick a single topic and explore a handful of questions in depth. So I'm Aidan Peppin. I'm the Policy and Responsible AI Lead at Cohere for AI. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Bran Knowles, who's Professor of Sociotechnical Systems at the University of Lancaster, and Shahar Avin, who is the Senior Research Associate at the Centre for Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. Both have been researching questions on how to effectively govern AI systems and the concrete mechanisms, from documentation to rules to standards, that are required to ensure their trustworthiness. So I have three big questions that I'll be asking and we'll be discussing, and a few smaller ones will crop up as we go, I'm sure. And of course, we would really like to explore your questions too in the audience. When we've run these before, the Q&A function has been full of great questions, which really help us get to the bottom of these things. So please do use the Q&A, and I'll draw your questions in as we go. So without further ado, why don't we get started? So Bran, Shahar, thanks for joining. You've both worked extensively in the space of AI and trust. And in our audience will be a mix of people that are either working to build AI systems or to govern them through policy and regulation. So the first question I wanted to kick off with is, if there was one thing that you wanted either AI developers or policymakers to know about trust and AI, what would it be? And maybe, Bran, I can go to you first.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to see you again, Aidan, and nice to meet you, Shahar. So before I answer your question, I thought it would be kind of important to know a little bit about how I got interested in trust in AI. So just to explain a little bit about my background, I'm in the School of Computing and Communications now, but my background is in social science. So my undergraduate degree was a mix of psychology, sociology, anthropology, and actually biology as well. And it was on comparative human development. Essentially, it's all about what makes people tick. And this is still where my interests lie now. So I got into computing through a master's degree in design ethnography. It was basically about using insights about people to inform better design. And some of my early work in that space was looking at the design of collaborative tools and figuring out how design could foster trust between collaborators, and also the benefits that could be gained by sort of specifically looking to foster trust. So all of that is to say that I come at the question of trust in AI as someone who's interested in people and in trust. And, you know, I won't claim that this is a completely unique starting point, but it's certainly different from the sort of traditional pathway in the field, which is the technologist who wants to understand how to get people to trust, or perhaps appropriately trust the technology. So the advantage of coming to trust in AI through trust, rather than through AI, is being familiar with some of the rich history of kind of philosophical musings on trust, and just how many different forms of trust there actually are. And trust is really weird because it's a thing that we all sort of instinctively think we understand. We can talk about it. We can point to it when we see it. But actually, it's not the same in all contexts. We have the same word for these subtly different phenomena that we experience in our lives. And I think this richness really isn't represented so far in the discourse on trust in AI. We talk about trust in AI in sort of singular form, not trusts. And I think technologists and policymakers will often apply the same logic and strategy to different stakeholders and different AIs and different contexts. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm specifically interested in public trust, as you know, Aidan, and there are, you know, legitimate ways of thinking about trust and trustworthiness, or trusted and trustworthy AI, that don't necessarily make sense when we apply them to the matter of public trust in AI. And, for example, the common argument about why does trust in AI matter is that distrust is this sort of barrier to widespread uptake. It's going to stop us from unleashing the potential of AI to realize all these amazing societal benefits. And I don't think this argument makes a lot of sense if we're talking about public trust. I certainly think it's a very limited way of thinking about why public trust matters. Now, for the subset of stakeholders who are involved in deciding whether to integrate AI into an organizational process, I tend to call these people purchasers. I think this narrative, this rationale sort of does make sense. If they don't trust it, they won't purchase it. A purchaser is going to be deeply invested in kind of poring over evidence that a system has gone through some sort of quality assurance process. They'll engage with evidence of trustworthiness for the individual AI that they're considering purchasing. With the exception of something like self-driving cars, maybe, the public is rarely kind of contemplating whether they trust the AI enough to purchase it, right? So that's a different kind of trust. Sometimes when we talk about trust in AI, we're really talking about expert user trust. So how a person who maybe needs to use an AI that's been brought into some sort of organizational process, how they're going to develop sort of appropriately calibrated trust so that they can use the AI effectively. And if we're talking about something like ChatGPT, then members of the public can be treated as users. But then again, they're very different to expert users still. And not just in terms of how much expertise they have technically. I think the most salient difference is that, again, the expert user is engaged in formulating trust with a specific individual AI, whereas the public encounters any number of AIs in a given day. They might not even always realize that they're encountering it, but I don't think they have the capacity to sort of actively consider trustworthiness. It's more of a background concern. So it's important to understand that different stakeholders will have different trusts. And that's a function of a variety of things. They'll have different levels of technical expertise, different awareness in their interactions with AI, different levels of motivation to engage in kind of figuring out whether an AI is trustworthy. And critically, they'll also have different agency in terms of their ability to accept or reject AI. I'm personally, particularly interested in the set of AI that's designed to make predictions about human behavior in order to decide whether to extend or withdraw opportunity to people. And the public here are very much subject to AI, which again is very different. They often can't reject AI even if they did distrust it. And this is where I get particularly annoyed about the narrative that public trust matters, because if they don't have trust, they'll reject it, right? Because, I mean, can they? Can they really reject it? And if they can't reject it, then are we suggesting that it doesn't matter that they might not trust it? So I was trying to think of an analogy to kind of make my point stick. And the best that I could come up with is if someone tried to argue that love matters because without love, we wouldn't have babies and the species would go extinct. Clearly this is wrong. You don't need love to have babies, and you don't need trust for people to rely on AI or subject themselves to its decision-making, right? But the other thing that's upsetting about this framing of the importance of love in this way is that clearly love matters for other reasons, right? And I think trust matters for other reasons too. We want a well-functioning society. You can't have that without trust. So you asked me to give one thing to say. I gave a long, long answer. There you go.
That's great, Bran. Thank you. There's a lot there to chew on, and I have to admit I wasn't expecting the idea of love to be coming up, but it's an analogy that I think really does land the point well. There's quite a few things I'd love to pick up on there, but I want to bring Shahar you into the conversation, and similar question to you. You know, if there was one thing that you wanted either those developing AI systems or those thinking about how to govern them to know about trust and AI, what would it be?
My love brand answer. I think my answer is gonna overlap, but gonna be presented slightly differently. And I'm gonna stick to three, but I'm gonna make each of these three relatively small because I mean, none of these three are my own. They're all things that I've kind of picked up along the way, but they really resonated with me and they stuck with me kind of years later when I think of it. The first one is an observation from Honora O'Neill, who's written a lot about the philosophy of trust. And she says, trust is a three-way relationship. A trusts B about C. It's not that I might trust the pharmacist to prescribe medicine to me. I might not trust them to be a lifelong partner. And that's very important in the context of AI because we often treat AI as a general purpose technology. Right? We want AI to do everything. We want ChatGPT to give me advice about everything in life. And it's very important that once we've established trustworthiness in one domain, we don't necessarily then transfer that assessment of trust to another domain in which the AI has not been proven. And it might even be this self-driving car performs very well in this sunny, slow driving culture, but that might not work in this other place. So remembering that when we assess trust or when we assess trustworthiness, the context of application matters and it would not travel easily. And to think that it would is a mistake that is a very costly mistake. The second one, which I remember I picked up from Ross Anderson, who's a security researcher. And he said, a lot of time when we talk about trust, we talk about the process we go through to assess whether someone is trustworthy. What we don't accept, what we tend to neglect is to trust is to admit a vulnerability. It's basically, I have some policy about myself, about what I accept and don't accept, what harms I'm trying to avoid. And to trust someone is to make an exception in that policy where I make myself vulnerable to a third party. So we think of, I go to the doctor and I trust him because he has a diploma on the wall and he says the right words and he asks me all the good questions. I don't think of what I am doing when I'm trusting the doctor is I'm giving him access to my body, which is not something I would do with a stranger in the street. It is that second part, the fact that I'm making myself vulnerable, open to harm, is at the core of trust. And the first thing is the processes we go through to ascertain when to allocate or not allocate a trust. And so we think about what are the harms we are willing to impose ourselves when we enter a trust relationship. That makes the problem much more acute. And I think the third one, which maybe brings us closest to policy, is when we have some kind of ecosystem to kind of match trust to trustworthiness, if there are no consequences for people breaking trust, it's not going to work. So you can have a system where lots of information is being shared, but if people routinely break the trust that has been entrusted to them, either its system or the people who develop and deploy systems, and there are no negative consequences to them for doing so, then we should not expect things to improve. And so thinking about how consequences get built into systems of trust is very important from a governance perspective. So three things.
Thank you. No, really great perspectives, and something that I think, well, firstly, I'm happy that Honora O'Neill's come up. I think you can't have a conversation about trust without her name coming up at some point. So thank you for kind of bringing her views and her work into the conversation. But I think something that you both kind of really highlight there is that context is so key here. So Bran, you mentioned different stakeholders trust differently. There are different types of trust. I think Shahar, A trusts B about C is so crucial here. And you might trust a pharmacist to do A, but not to do B necessarily. And it kind of makes me think of a kind of third aspect here, which I wanted to get your thoughts on, which is that actually sometimes mistrust is important as well. And it's about where trust or mistrust is correctly placed. So for example, you don't want to. The goal is not to always have perfect trust in sort of I trust everything, because actually you don't want to trust a bad actor. You don't want to trust a doctor that's got a fake diploma. You don't want to trust a cyber hacker who's trying to get hold of your details. So actually knowing when to trust something and when not to trust something is just as important. And in the context of AI, when we have different models and products and services, just in the same way that you want to, choose the right car that's going to be right for your environment and isn't going to break down all the time, we have that same kind of question of where to accurately place trust or mistrust, and context is going to be so dependent on that. I'm just curious if how you view that value of mistrust as well in this conversation. Bran, go for it.
Well, I mean, that appropriately calibrated trust is a thing that we hear about a lot well, maybe not enough, but we do hear about it. The only thing I would caution is that who's to say what's appropriate? What's the appropriate calibration? So, I mean, people will have different perspectives on what makes something trustworthy. And that's not just in terms of maybe differences in values, which relate to trustworthiness, but different kind of uses and contexts and applications and all these things, right? So, so I think context again comes back into kind of appropriate calibration. That's my instinct. What do you think, Shahar?
Yeah, I agree. So I think what we want is trust to map onto trustworthiness. And then you ask, okay, so what's a trustworthiness? And I think another distinction that's useful to introduce is there is a significant difference between trusting technology and artifacts, this particular model, versus trusting in individual or organization. Primarily because they have incentives and motives that we can try and model. And we can, like, I don't ask whether my car is trying to be helpful or not, or has some other motive. I ask, is it reliable? Is it going to break down? Is it going to get me to some place? Whereas I can absolutely and should ask, is this company working in my best interest? Do they have ulterior motives? Are there systemic incentives that align what they want with what is good for me? And that should be part of trustworthiness. With AI, it's getting tricky because we're getting to a point where technology is embedding a lot of values quite specifically. And so it's maybe not strictly just reliability. And maybe that will be a fruitful point for further conversation.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of, we're getting into the territory of the second question I wanted to explore with you both. So maybe I'll turn to there. And it's kind of come up a little bit. I mean, again, Shahar, you mentioned the idea of, the diploma on the wall that helps you know that the doctor is trustworthy. So I think it kind of points to this other question around what are those markers of trustworthiness? And we, both in sort of the broad context of trust, but specifically in the sense of AI, what is it that needs to be created, or what mechanisms or concrete tools might be necessary to establish whether or not, or assess whether or not an AI system or the company that's developing it or deploying it is trustworthy. So I wonder if you could maybe speak to sort of what modes or models for trust, what concrete mechanisms there are that we can draw on in this context that will help create that trust. And Bran, I think you already kind of pointed to documentation being quite important in a purchaser of an AI system being able to assess whether it's the right one. So I'm curious for your thoughts on this question of those concrete mechanisms for establishing trustworthiness and assessing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this growing attention or interest in auditing as a way forward is important. Generally, the right approach, if we're thinking about developing a kind of regulatory ecosystem, this is what I've been kind of calling for a while, because as I explained before, I think we need people looking out for the public. I think the public is trying to figure out, is anyone in charge here? Do they have the relevant expertise to evaluate the trustworthiness of these systems? Do they indeed have the power to enforce certain rules that will protect people from AI harms? You've heard me talk about before, sort of institutional trust as a way of thinking about this. The public doesn't necessarily trust individual AIs. They don't have, this doesn't scale to a society where AI is pervasive, right? So instead they trust or distrust this sort of institution that regulates AI and guarantees its trustworthiness in some sense. And I think auditing is kind of a crucial function of that institution. It needs to be developed. My concern, though, recently, what I've been musing about, is the risk of taking kind of a purely technocratic approach to that auditing, that doesn't make room for non-expert opinions about what makes AI trustworthy or untrustworthy. And I'm worried about that because it means that we'll ultimately fail to address the concerns that animate public distrust. So, that's not going to promote trust, assuming we agree that public trust matters. But it's also going to lead to a potentially really problematic blindness about aspects of trustworthiness that aren't currently captured by the metrics that we have available, and we report on through things like documentation. So obviously there's been a huge amount of activity in trying to develop trustworthiness metrics for this very purpose, so that someone can kind of audit an AI system and declare it trustworthy according to some agreed standard or criteria. But I think what's sort of troubling is that the field of trustworthy AI, if we want to call it that, has no idea really how any of the things it can measure might translate into trust, or more specifically, how they translate into public trust. I think we have a better idea of how they translate into kind of purchaser trust, maybe. So we're being led on trustworthiness by those with a technical perspective on what makes something trustworthy. And actually, I think that there's a general attitude that this should be left to technologists to figure out, that trustworthiness is a technical matter. And actually, the sort of inevitable follow-up to this argument is that it doesn't really matter if the public distrusts AI, that the technologists or auditors would deem trustworthy. Because if they do, then they're just sort of misunderstanding how trustworthy it is, right? And if we decide that their opinion isn't technically valid, chances are we're going to stop asking them for their opinion. And when we do this, we're going to miss out on what distrust is communicating about how these systems can cause harm in ways that we don't necessarily see from our perspective. So I've been thinking about this recently in terms of what Miranda Fricker calls testimonial injustice, which is her term for failing to extend credence to another person's testimony. So in this case, sort of failing to take public distrust as a measure of untrustworthiness. Like, that's somebody telling you this is untrustworthy, right? And I sort of hinted at this before, but it's often forgotten that trustworthiness is from a perspective, and the public's perspective isn't always going to align with the perspective of the technologists, but that doesn't make it wrong. Particularly a person who has direct experience of being systematically disadvantaged or marginalized may well understand AI's tendency to harm and marginalize them or people like them better than the technologist does. So if they distrust an AI because they see it doing these things, their distrust is entirely logical, right? They've diagnosed a way that AI can be untrustworthy. And I think it means that their distrust should be seen as a really important signal that should guide developers in diagnosing some of the potential social harms of the systems that they develop. So if we bothered to listen and actively kind of cared about people's distrust, the reasons that they give for distrusting can illuminate some of the risks and failures that a developer can't see from their own perspective. And by extension, that auditors can't necessarily see from theirs. So that was a long answer, which basically is saying, I think we need auditing, but we can't rely on metrics to the exclusion of really deeply engaging with affected people to understand the reasons why they might perceive an AI to be untrustworthy. And I think that the hard work that we need to do is developing some sort of bridge between the public and this world of auditing, this sort of regulatory ecosystem, a kind of society in the loop model, so that we're actually sure that we're measuring the things that matter and not just the things that are measurable.
So I think you won't be surprised to hear I agree with a lot of that perspective of the value of kind of the public views and public trust. I think one of the things that I want to pick up on a little bit there is use the word signal, and I think from kind of the experience I have of working with folks who are developing and deploying these systems is that I think yes, you're probably right that there is the scales are balanced slightly more towards these technocratic approaches. I think that's a correct kind of observation. I think one of the things though is that the mechanisms by which we might rebalance that scale are going to rely on mechanisms that those developing and deploying these systems can. So there's got like I think it's not the right answer to have some kind of metric for public trustworthiness, but I think the point I'm trying to kind of explore is that for those developing and deploying these systems, it might not be feasible or indeed practical to be consistently kind of from scratch reinventing the wheel to gather public input on whether or not a system is trustworthy, and how would you even do that in a reliable and robust way? So I think one of the questions that maybe the field as a whole would need to explore here is how do we find those bridging mechanisms that allow these questions around where a public's trust is on a scale in a way that can be then fed into a development process to then say, okay, then you need to tweak this or change that, and that will affect the score up and down. Because I mean, if we look at, say, like risk metrics, there's some work by some groups at the moment looking at how you can develop these benchmarks for the safety of models that are looking at, okay, well, if the model generates X percentage of toxic outputs, we might deem it this level of risk. And that's something where the folks on the policy and governance end can say, yes, this is great because this is addressing safety concerns that we have in this world, but it's also useful to the technical audiences because they have something they can measure their models against and take action against. And I guess the question that's on my mind, and I think relates to a lot of what you were talking through there, is how do we similarly, maybe codify is the wrong word, but kind of bring those tangible mechanisms to get at some of the public sentiment around these technologies in a way that technologists can make use of. I don't know whether that fits at all with your thinking, or you have thoughts on that.
Yes, I don't have answers. I have the same questions as you. I think, unfortunately, some of the methods that are really good for getting at the answers to some of these questions are really costly. They're really time consuming. And the answers that you're going to get are sometimes really individual, really individuated, right? I mean, I think one of the things is like it would be much easier if there were only occasionally people distrusting, and then you just go to those people and you're like, what can we still tweak, right? What do we still need to work on? I think the distrust is so pervasive now that it's hard to know where to start. So maybe it is a case of sort of starting with better kind of processes for tracking the things that we can track now, and trying to accumulate some sort of momentum towards trust, and then diving deeper into the lingering sort of distrusting holdouts. But I mean, I think like co-design is the method I would tend to go for, and it's not something you can just do, for every single AI and, with every type of person. So yeah, it's really tricky.
I like the idea of this group or groups of just ultra skeptics existing that you can just tap into what they're saying and get some ideas. Thank you. Yeah, Shahar, I realize I haven't brought you into the conversation for a few minutes now. So yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on all of what Bran said there, but also more broadly on what are these concrete mechanisms or tools that will help us establish a way of understanding, assessing, ensuring trustworthiness of AI systems.
No, I really enjoy the conversation. I think it's pointing in the right direction. Maybe I'll start with a shameless plug. I helped co-author this big report called Towards Trustworthy AI Development. We did a kind of 3-page summary of it in Science under the heading of Filling Gaps in Trustworthy AI. And it was really designed, this was like 2020-ish, So before governments woken up to the idea that it is now clearly time to regulate and put in place an ecosystem of auditing and setting up the safety institutes and so on. But it's just a long list of concrete mechanisms to assess the trustworthiness of AI developers. And it has things like internal red teaming, third-party auditing, funding for third parties to do like bias bounties and bug bounties and vulnerability bounties, incident reporting, incident sharing, audit trails so you can go back and see what went wrong. Those kinds of things, as well as some other tools that we thought they're not necessarily about establishing trustworthiness, just tools that we know if you deploy them makes your AI more trustworthy. For example, if you use privacy preserving machine learning, then you cut out a big concern that people justifiably are worried about. So just use it. If you don't use it, you're less trustworthy. But that, so there is one list, and clearly these things have evolved over time. I think for each of these, you have a good question of what kind of knowledge you need to do your job well. Which relates exactly to the conversation we've just had. If you ever see an AI company who don't have, ideally on their payroll, or at least directly in conversation with them, the people who are a good model of their user. So if you have a health AI company who don't have doctors in it, but also an education AI who don't have teachers on it, just don't buy their products. They are almost definitely not going to do a good job, and it's going to kind of blow up at some point down the line. Don't invest in them. For the ones who do have a few of them on the payroll, they ask, how much diversity and how open they are to changing environments and like how good are they to take account. And particularly if someone goes for very general purpose AI, then it gets trickier, right? Because you're not going to have people within the company who are dealing with every single use case of the thing that you're developing. Ideally, what you have there is that they are not B2C companies, but that they give their services to other companies who give tailored services in a domain, unless it's somehow super low risk. But our ability to just judge that something is low risk is poor. We're going to get this wrong, and things are going to get better over time. I think there is now a much broader recognition that we need more democratic input into the governance of AI, we need participatory co-design, and so on. The big questions are, who's going to pay for it? What are going to be the consequences if you don't do it and then things go wrong? How do you incentivize enough innovation in an environment where you do have those constraints? And those are institution design questions that we don't have good answers to yet. I think partly the more we do the more companies find the right kind of thing, like they have gone through the regulatory hurdles, maybe in slightly more regulated domains like defense or health, and there are best practices that they can be shared into less regulated domains that could be a way of establishing trust. There will be like the few products who have really cracked the community engagement and participation, and maybe paid a few big fines for getting things wrong, and they have been very open about how they learn from those mistakes. Those would be the exemplars of trust, and then other people will say, we will do things the way they did it. And then regulators could eventually come around and say, anyone who doesn't do things that way is going to get a big fine. But that's a process that takes years. Ideally, we go through that with as little harm as possible. The concern now is that the incentive to deploy and deploy fast significantly outweighs anything that we're talking about right now. And that means that we're probably in for avoidable harms.
I think there's a lot there to definitely mull on. I'm just going to put the, I think this is that the right link to the science? I've just put it in the chat, correct? If that's not the right link to the piece you're referring to, please correct it. But also shameless plugs are great. And for the audience's benefit, I did tell both Bran and Shahar beforehand to shamelessly plug their work. So totally above board here. I think, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like the question of, things are going to go wrong, mistakes are going to be made. Some companies will try very hard to get this right and make mistakes along the way. There are other companies that may not try so hard and will make even more mistakes along the way. And it's not just companies too as well, right? But, we can think about health systems that want to deploy these systems, governments that want to deploy these systems. It makes me think, and actually, Bran, when you were in your point, some of your points as well reminded me of kind of trust is kind of there are different variables, and two of them can be like competence and intent. So, you know, you might trust the and then there have been a lot of studies which look at, like, in the context of the National Health Service in the UK, people really, really trust the intent of the National Health Service to try and do the right thing, but don't always trust the competence or capability because of questions around funding or overburdening and so on. And I think that's also very true here, that you might then trust the competence and capability of a company with lots of technical expertise, but if they don't have the doctors, if they're a health app, or the teachers, if they're an education platform, would you trust that they have the right intentions and knowledge to do it? So I think there's a lot there that is very applicable to this question. And the other thing it makes me realize as well, and this is definitely congruent with, I think, the experience of lots of people working to develop and deploy and govern these systems, is that a lot of this is kind of nascent, and we're still figuring it out. We're still figuring out what the right frameworks are, and we're still making the mistakes that will be learned from. And one of the other questions I wanted to explore here, though, as well, is that even though lots of this is nascent and is new, it's not the first time that a novel technology or technoscientific space has you know, come across questions around trustworthiness, or how to be governed well, or how to act responsibly. And I think there's a lot that can be, when I've been in kind of conversations talking about trust, I often think about, you know, food safety or aviation, and how there are whole systems of trust there that make, you know, me as a consumer feel comfortable buying a sandwich from a shop without testing the kitchen myself or boarding a plane. And of course, I'm slightly scared, but I'm fairly confident that the correct checks and balances are in place. So I'm just curious around, when we're thinking about the context of AI governance and AI trust, what can be learned from those other spaces? And maybe Shahar, I'll come straight back to you on that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think many things to say, though. Maybe we'll start from the end, right? You just mentioned aviation safety. And we've seen, maybe recently, with more evidence coming out of Boeing, that, you know, we all kept aviation like this gold standard of like how you do safety engineering across an industry, and like you shape the incentives right. So there is a lot of lots of people involved do the right thing to maximize safety all along the way. And now we realize even that can ossify or be put under commercial pressures, and it doesn't always work. And so it's an ongoing effort. I think it's been a very good wake-up call that whatever we design, no matter how close to perfect we get it today, 10 years from now, it could still completely fail because the incentives have changed, or the implementation has failed, or the good people have left, or whatever. So that's sobering, but is important to remember. I think within that, a lot of it is about erring on the side of transparency, sharing information about failure, understanding what failure could be, and showing that you have learned from failure, and maybe there were some consequences where you were in a position to go another way and didn't. And there are some penalties for that. That's the start, and that's true for any technology. You go back to some other like general purpose technologies that massively change our life. You go back to electricity. Very early days of electricity were scientists hoisting children up in parties in French salons and electrifying them and seeing feathers sticking to their feet. It's very different from what large-scale industrial deployment of electricity looks like. And in the early days of those, you had people being electrocuted by doorknobs, and installers being electrocuted on poles and falling out. It was one of those incidents where an installer kind of got electrocuted in a very gruesome way that led some of the regulation to happen. Hopefully, we can avoid some of that with AI, but we need to remember that, you know, a lot of incentive to come in more strongly will come because of mistakes. There was some recent work we've done on COVID suggests that, you know, regulation post-crisis is rarely as clean as you would expect it to be. You would think that, oh, everyone talks about this horrible thing that could happen. Once it happens, the next year, everyone clears house and does the right thing. And that's clearly not what has happened with COVID. And it seems that is more generally not the case with other technologies as well. There are other ingredients that need to go in to get good regulation going. I think with nuclear, with GMOs, there were kind of deep and persistent issues of mistrust. There are some elements about the technology itself. invisibility, poor understanding of what's happening, some questions about what's natural and what's not natural. It is probably highly relevant to AI. There are elements of technologies being wrapped up in politics. We saw this with vaccines around the pandemic. This is highly likely to happen with AI in the coming years, though we're not there yet. And if we can avoid it, it would be great. We probably cannot avoid it. Yeah, are there good results there? I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be really hard to get a good governance system for AI going. I think issues of trust are going to be persistent because I think it's a very tricky set of technologies to get right. Partly because of their unpredictable nature, partly because of the amount of power they give to individuals, partly because the general incentives in the ecosystem they come from, which is software, has not dealt well with questions of trust to begin with, right? You buy an operating system and you just expect that it will have bugs and it will occasionally crash, and that's just normal. And we've inherited all of that baggage into AI. So I think we have our work cut out for us, but I don't know. Maybe I'll pass it now to the two of you to see what you think about this.
I think one of the things I was just going to say was, I don't know, maybe this is a slightly optimistic view, but it gives me hope that like many people working on developing AI are also thinking about how to do it safely. We could argue maybe that's before anyone got electrocuted and fell out of a pole. But we could also argue it's probably also some electrocutions have already started happening. But I think the fact that it feels like if we can remember, we're not starting from scratch here, that there is work going on, but mistakes will still happen and they still need to be learned from. I think that's an important part of the conversation here. Bran, I'm going to throw it to you in just a sec, but we have a question in the Q&A, which I'll come to in a moment. But just as a reminder, folks listening, please do drop questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll pick up a few of those before we wrap up the conversation for sure. And your questions will undoubtedly be better than mine, so please do throw them in. But yeah, Bran, what's on your mind right now?
Well, of course, the two examples that I tend to go to are aviation and kind of food and supermarkets, to kind of understand how people come to trust in things when they don't have themselves the sort of requisite expertise to evaluate trustworthiness. But I was thinking a little bit deeper about the aviation analogy today, and it's not just that it's regulated; it's that there's oversight at all these stages. We kind of understand that, but a lot of that oversight is made visible in really small ways. It's part of the performance of flying, and safety checks are done really visibly. So I was thinking that, some of the trust in aviation obviously grew over time, and it grew out of there being, processes for oversight, but also by allowing these sort of glimpses into that oversight through these safety performances that remind people that there are these very clear processes and that safety is taken very seriously. So I think that's the more important lesson to take here, that we need to develop the oversight mechanisms, but we also need to find ways of almost publicly performing this oversight or demonstrating like why it matters, why it's being taken seriously, how we're making it work. So this can't all happen behind closed doors. I think people need sort of glimpses into how it's working, and also when it doesn't work. So I like this topic of kind of making mistakes. I like that that's come up. I don't think that making mistakes necessarily will eliminate trust. I think that it's about verbalizing the lessons learned, as you were suggesting, Shahar. And I'm reminded of the Anaro O'Neill point about trust. Telling the truth doesn't eliminate distrust, right? It just helps, right? And I think it relates to what you were pointing out before about, I mean, you were talking about sort of capability and benevolence, but there's also that integrity component. I think that's the integrity, right? You know, I don't often cite the ABI model, but sometimes it applies, right? And so there's that integrity component of demonstrating actually we do kind of care about these things. I mean, as I said, the other analogy I tend to think about is about when you walk into a supermarket, if you had to think about the trustworthiness of all of the things on the shelves, you'd be completely overwhelmed and ill-equipped to do so. So you place your trust in the institution. The reason I like that is because I think we underestimate the work that would be required for any individual member of the public to kind of wrap their head around what like, how do I know whether anything's trustworthy, right? And they have to do that not just for, as I was saying before, not just a specific AI, but anything they might encounter, all the things that have these sort of AI components in their lives, right? It's just not a reasonable task. But the other thing I was thinking about these two analogies is there are limitations to thinking about these two, because they both center questions of safety. And, you know, safety questions are certainly relevant to certain kinds of AI. And I think demonstrating safety in some ways is easier than demonstrating something like fairness. And I think that at the heart of the public's attitudes toward AI, in its sort of aggregate, like mythical form, is actually a battle of values and even maybe a sort of class conflict. And I think we need to be looking for some historical examples that can be a good model for how trust can be built through a kind of shared understanding of what we value as a society and even who we value as a society. And I don't know what those models are. But I don't think it's aviation and I don't think it's supermarkets, right? It's something else.
Right, I agree. I think these as any good data scientist will tell you, all models are useful, but they're not necessarily accurate or true or perfect. But it makes me think as well, you know, I think a point you made there is quite important, that you know, it's not so fragile that one mistake will kind of bring the trustworthiness in these systems all the way down, but vice versa. You know, one good act of trustworthiness is not going to kind of make everything good forever. It's an ongoing process whereby there'll be, you know, and again, we just said the analogies aren't perfect, but if you have a sandwich from one company and it gives you food poisoning, you probably won't buy from that company again, but you're still going to eat sandwiches. You'll just get them from you know, elsewhere, and you might read the packet a bit more closely. And I think that's the other thing, that this is not kind of all or nothing, but very complex and many different kind of institutions involved as well. And it makes me think of a conversation I had with, I can't remember who, but another researcher working on this around kind of the notion of outsourcing trust. We outsource our trust to the supermarket, again, to keep the analogy going, to make the decision on what food to stock and so on. So yeah, loads here to chew on, and it kind of also makes me think, like, you know, what's a flight test recorder for an AI system? How do we have these sorts of things that allow you to gather the data and then do the analysis and so on? But we've got a few questions in the chat, and there's one that I think picks up on some of what we were just talking about there, and Bran, some of the points you made, that, you know, is AI the sort of thing that can be trustworthy? Does it make sense to think more of reliability or something we have competence in? Shahar, I think you maybe made some points along these lines already. Do you want to pick that up and expand?
Yeah. So I think one easy thing to say is that AI developers can be trustworthy or not trustworthy. They are people as part of an institution with a bunch of incentives. They can have or not have benevolence, integrity, and competence, and ability. And you can assess that based on the track record. And there are various costly signals that they can give you to kind of show that they are more trustworthy. And a lot of the mechanisms we've talked about are precisely of that nature, right? You, as a developer, you need to actively do something that is costly to you that makes you more trustworthy to another party, by exposing information, kind of committing to more rigorous testing, giving your product out to more people to test, and so on. But the products themselves can be more or less trustworthy. And I think, I mean, we can mince words, but are we going to see a world in which students accept the outputs of generative AI models as part of their learning trajectory? I think so. Is it meaningful to use the language of trust in that context? I think so. I think it is useful to say these students trust ChatGPT even though they shouldn't because it hallucinates. It's a grammatical sentence in English that teaches us something, and so we can use the language in this context. And then we can do analysis and realize all of these interesting things about incentives and capability and reliability and embodied values in the technology and the process by which they came about and who is responsible and so on.
Bran, do you have any thoughts to add on that one?
That was a much better answer than I would have given. I think a theme that's coming up repeatedly here is trust and trustworthiness are not necessarily directly one-to-one mapping, right? And part of that, I mean, is the fact that trustworthiness is a perception, right? And there are various reasons why you might perceive something to be trustworthy or untrustworthy. The fact that you are distrusting it suggests that you are seeing something in it that is untrustworthy. All I'm hinting at is that I don't think an AI system can be objectively trustworthy, but it becomes more trustworthy if somebody has taken the time to attend to the matters that make you distrust it. Does that make any sort of sense?
It's
complicated.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. No, I think it comes back to if we're thinking about kind of the title of this session, tangible trustworthiness, the way you make it tangible is you focus on all of these things around the system, the people developing it, the people deploying it, the checks and balances, etc. And you might look at different factors of each of those things, how reliable they might be, how transparent they are about the certain ways they do things, the codes and rules they're following, and that's true for any technological or scientific discipline, I suppose. Yeah, there's a couple of other questions here that I might sort of pull together because I think they're getting at some of the, I guess, very complicated socio-political and socio-cultural subjectivities and aspects here that it's good for us to touch on. So the questions are sort of saying, when we're thinking about how models approach historical contexts and have to navigate things like religion, politics, history, there might be discrepancies in how they treat some of those aspects, talking about particular faiths in different ways, and they're scraping the web that contains lots of different information and perspectives, and how a user or how an individual receives the output of it might, be I guess propaganda to one person might be true to another person. So I guess the question here I think is maybe getting at, when it comes to the fact that assessments of trustworthiness are going to be so dependent on an individual user or group of users' responses, and that might differ to another. How do we've talked a little bit about I guess the differences in how a developer might approach these systems. Bran, you talked at the start around kind of different users' trust in different ways. How does that play into the I guess socio-cultural variety of the environments in which these systems might get deployed?
Oh dear, is that for me to answer first?
Not saying, oh dear, it's a big one. Maybe this is the unanswerable question we'll never get to the bottom of. But if you have thoughts.
I have thoughts, but it's taking me to a lecture that I just finished writing for my undergrads, who I felt like I sort of crushed their spirit a little bit. They're in their first year of their computer science degree, and I'm telling them all the things that AI, how it causes harm and all this. So I felt I needed to end with a lecture about actually there's some good here. There's some good news. And I brought myself to a really optimistic place. And the point I was making in the lecture is just that I don't know the answer to these questions, but we weren't having these really, really, really rich ethics discussions until AI sort of surfaced all of these intricacies and challenges. So I think it's motivating a real depth of conversation on things that matter, things that we struggled to kind of get handholds for before in conversation. Like, what are the levers for change? And I think AI is forcing us to go there. So I think that's an amazing opportunity. I think we should just keep going, but I don't think we're not there yet, obviously, with answers to big questions like this.
Look, I mean, I'm very glad you've as we come to the end of this session, you've brought us to the end of your lecture, which has that positive note. I think, and also, you can't have conversations like this without saying, and there's more work to be done. But perhaps I'll turn to you, Shahar. What are your thoughts there, or indeed, reflections back across the conversation as we come towards the end of it? What's going through your mind now?
It's been really fun. I think there is a team member in Cambridge, Maurice Kyodo, who has been working on ethics in maths for years and years, and then he got to us in AI. And he's just, his personal issue that he always repeats is people who are building AI, by and large, are mathematically trained, and they've been told that they just don't need to touch values because values are other people's problem, and they can just, solve the problem ahead of them with the mathematical tools that they have available to them. This is just, I think, generative AI with language is just so quickly a demonstration of how that view does not apply. And there is no objective, nice measure that you can optimize for that will give you a product that everyone will be like, yes, that's a good solution. Full marks, go and deploy it into the world. From there, we can generalize to the vast majority of AI systems and see that the values creep into every step along the way. And we need people who are sensitive to that. And we need processes that make sure that the people who develop and deploy the AI are sensitive to that. Until we have that, we shouldn't trust it.
I think what you're saying makes me reflect on the fact that there are increasing numbers of people from, I guess, the worlds of philosophy, social science that are finding their way into tackling some of those questions. And I think you're right. We need those, actually, I wrote down right at the top the word interdisciplinarity, because I think both of you made points in your opening thoughts around kind of the nature of the we can't just, these aren't just yes, no binary questions. There's a lot of maybe, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of numbers in between 1 and 0. And it's going to take all kinds of different perspectives to navigate some of this. And another thing I wrote down along the way was that this isn't like a one and done. We're not going to solve this and then move on. Cool, we made AI trustworthy now. Let's all pack up, go to the beach and kind of have a nice drink. It's going to be a continual process over the life cycle of this technology as it finds its way into society. We're coming right up against time, and I know everyone that's listening, and Shahar and Bran, I'm sure you have other places that you need to get to, or indeed you want to start your weekend, which I think is a very good decision, especially if you're on UK time, and hey, why not if you're on US time as well. But before we do wrap, I just want to give either of you the chance for a quick final thought, if there's something that you've been burning to say but haven't had the chance yet. Bran, anything from you?
I don't have a final thought, but I'm pleased that we're sort of on the same page with this conversation. It was exciting that there was resonance across the different answers. So that gives me hope as well.
Thanks, Bran. Shahar?
Yeah, thank you for convening us. This has been really fun. And I mean, I don't want to be too negative. I mean, it's not like other people have the answers, and if you kind of walk away from the conversation being like, I'm not on the same wavelength as these people, then I'm doing something wrong. We're all struggling. We don't know what the right answer is. As long as you are attending to the problem, you're already, a significant way towards, helping us figure out the solutions.
I think that's right. And actually, one of my goals for these sessions is that we probably will never get, if we do one of these sessions and we feel like we've got halfway through and we've solved everything, then there's something probably not quite right there. But thank you so much both for your time. Thanks to everyone that's listened in. There's a comment that's just come in saying that from Leanne saying she's adored the session. I have too. Thank you, Bran. Thank you, Shahar, for your time. We'll be doing another one of these in a month's time on the 7th of June, where hopefully we're going to start looking at the development of some standards and codes of practice. So stay tuned for more information on that. And again, Bran, Shahar, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. I hope everyone has a great end of their week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.